I got the call on a Thursday morning while sitting in a quiet hotel boardroom in Vienna, just after wrapping up a 4-day negotiation with a global logistics firm. The early summer sunlight was spilling through the tall windows, making the copper domes of the old city glow. And yet, in the seconds that followed, the world around me seemed to dim, like someone had turned down the volume on reality. On the other end of the line was my wife, Melanie. Her voice was calm, too calm, and there was something rehearsed about the way she said it. "I've made my decision. I'm filing for divorce. And I've already sold the Bay House. Derek and I need a fresh start." She laughed as she said it, not nervously, not kindly, but with a hollow, smug kind of amusement, like I was the last person to figure out the joke, and the punchline was my own life falling apart. I didn't shout. I didn't slam the table or curse or demand answers. I just sat there for a beat, breathing in slow, and asked evenly, "When did the sale go through?" "Yesterday," she replied, hesitating just a little, maybe thrown off by how calm I sounded. "The buyer's moving in next week. I figured, you wouldn't mind staying at a hotel for a while. You're always traveling anyway." Maybe Melanie thought I'd just roll over, that I'd be too tired, too distracted, too used to swallowing disappointment to notice how far we'd drifted. Maybe she believed I hadn't seen the signs, but she forgot one thing. My name is Frank Holloway, and I've spent the last 23 years working in real estate legal strategy, reviewing contracts line by line, defending assets others thought were already lost. I live in the fine print, and what Melanie never realized is that while she was planning her exit, I was already securing mine, quietly, carefully, and with the same precision I've used to win hundreds of cases. And this time, the case was my own. I met Melanie at a business seminar in Charleston 16 years ago. She was sharp, ambitious, dressed like she had something to prove. And she usually did. At the time, she worked in upscale property staging, moving through penthouses and lakefront estates like she owned them. I was there to speak on asset shielding strategies in commercial property law. We ended up sitting next to each other at a networking dinner, and by the end of the night, I was captivated by how easily she moved between charm and calculation, like she could slip in and out of roles depending on who she needed to be in the room. Within a year, we got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, just her sister, my brother, and a lunch reservation we barely made because Melanie had changed dresses twice. We bought the Bay House in Arlen's Point 3 years later, a weather-worn but dignified property with a wraparound porch and a view of the open water that made you feel like the ocean belonged to you, even if only for a little while. I poured nearly all of my savings into it, along with a sizable mortgage, telling myself it would be our legacy, a place to age, to heal, to remember. Weekends were spent stripping old siding, rewiring the kitchen, replacing floorboards on the deck. She picked out curtains and throw pillows, held wine nights for her friends, and told everyone it was our forever home. I believed her. I really did. In those early years, we found a rhythm that felt solid. Melanie eventually left staging to launch her own interior design business, which gave her the flexibility to travel with me when I had overseas clients. We strolled the streets of Lisbon, sipped coffee in Copenhagen, spent entire weekends in hotel rooms looking out at foreign skylines, talking about renovations we wanted to make back home. I told myself we were lucky. Not everyone got to combine love with adventure, routine with spontaneity. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet and gradual, like a slow leak in the hull of a ship you don't notice until the floorboards are wet. She started skipping my calls during trips, brushing off my questions about her schedule with vague responses. Meetings, client calls, Girl time. The texts grew colder, shorter. Good luck today, or hope your flight's smooth, without the warmth that once wrapped around our words like a hug through the screen. She stopped asking about my work entirely, as if it no longer interested her, or worse, never really had. Then came the gym membership, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, training with Derek Martin, a man 12 years younger than her, someone I'd once mistaken for a temporary phase. A former college linebacker turned personal trainer. He had a car too expensive for his clientele, a laugh too loud for someone in his position, and the kind of tan you only get when you don't work as much as you claim to. At first, I was supportive. I told myself it was good for her, that staying healthy mattered, that maybe the changes in her mood were hormonal or just a midlife itch, something we'd outgrow. But then I started noticing things that didn't line up. There were credit card charges for places I'd never been. Upscale lounges, boutique spas, resorts tucked away in towns I hadn't heard her mention. She went on retreats with friends whose names never came up again. Her scent changed. Perfumes I didn't recognize, laundry that smelled like hotel sheets, even though she'd claimed to be home. Still, I didn't confront her. I didn't hire a private investigator like some of my colleagues had when their marriages cracked. I didn't plant GPS trackers or obsess over browser histories. That's not who I am. I've always believed that when someone wants to deceive you, they will. But if you watch closely and patiently, they'll eventually trip over their own story. So instead of reacting, I started preparing. 11 months ago, I transferred the Bay House into a revocable living trust under my name, structured discreetly through refinancing paperwork connected to an investment duplex in Savannah. I had her sign the documents during a casual lunch at home. She barely looked up from her phone as she scrolled, thumb moving with the urgency of someone who had more important things to tend to than legal documents. I told her it was routine, a restructure to help with tax offsets. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. The trust did protect our assets, just not in the way she assumed. She didn't ask questions. She never followed up. I filed the paperwork, archived the notarized deed, and went on with life like nothing had changed, even though everything had. She became more distant, more preoccupied with her reflection, her phone, her future, and I quietly documented it all, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Because if she was already halfway out the door, I needed to make sure the house she was trying to take with her, legally and emotionally, was no longer hers to claim. After I hung up with Melanie that morning in Vienna, I didn't storm out of the hotel or book the next flight home, nor did I sit in a fog of helplessness, wondering where everything had gone wrong. Instead, I opened my laptop with the same precision I'd used 100 times before when handling high-stakes contract disputes, and I typed 2 short emails. One to Monica Evans, my title agent for over a decade, and the other to Ben Hollowell, the attorney I've trusted longer than I trusted my marriage. The subject line was clear and simple. Urgent. Attempted fraudulent sale. Outside, the city was waking up under a light drizzle, people moving briskly with umbrellas and purpose. But I remained still, watching raindrops streak the window as my reflection stared back at me. Not broken, not vengeful, just resolute. I knew this moment would come. I had felt it long before Melanie ever said the words. Long before Derek's name started showing up on her lips with that peculiar mix of casual intimacy and dismissiveness she used when testing boundaries. For the past year, I'd been quietly positioning myself for this exact scenario. Not because I expected betrayal, but because I'd learned the hard way that trusting blindly can cost you more than money. It can cost you your dignity. Months ago, I'd structured a living trust specifically designed to protect our Bay House from exactly this kind of blindside, embedding it within refinancing paperwork that blended naturally with documents tied to our rental property in South Carolina. Melanie had signed every page without question, too distracted by her phone and a lunch reservation she was running late for to notice the words "sole trustee" next to my name. I told her the restructuring would help us reduce our liability exposure and create flexibility for future investments. And while that wasn't a lie, it was far from the whole truth. What it actually did was remove the house from joint ownership entirely, placing it in my trust, legally shielding it from any future sale unless authorized by me, and me alone. She had no idea. And frankly, that's what worried me the most. Not her infidelity, not even her deceit, but her arrogance. The assumption that I, a man who had built his entire career on spotting hidden clauses and protecting client assets, wouldn't have done the same for myself. And so I waited. I carried the deed with me everywhere I traveled, a habit that started back when a client once tried to retract a deal by questioning the legitimacy of a document he never even read. It might have seemed obsessive to some, carrying the trust copy across oceans and time zones. But for me, it was insurance, a line of defense against people who mistake calm for weakness. That day in Vienna, the very copy of the deed was tucked inside my briefcase, safe and clean and notarized, showing clearly that the Bay House was no longer owned by Frank and Melanie Holloway, but by the Holloway Revocable Trust, with me as the sole executor. That meant any sale, including the one Melanie had already smugly claimed was complete, was invalid, unenforceable, and potentially illegal. As I walked through the cobbled streets of the city's historic centre toward a quiet cafe where I could think more clearly, I called Ben and laid out the situation. He didn't interrupt, didn't gasp or scold, just listened the way lawyers do when they already see the outline of a win forming in their mind. "She can't sell what she doesn't legally own," he said when I was done. "Any transaction she initiated is fraudulent, and the buyer has no rightful claim. I'll have the local clerk flag the property immediately, notify title offices, and freeze transfer rights until we get formal documentation submitted. This sale stops now." I nodded silently, even though he couldn't see me. The truth was, I didn't want Melanie arrested or dragged through court. As much as her actions cut me open, the lies, the calculated betrayal, the casual cruelty of it all, I didn't want to destroy her. I just wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, and that walking away didn't mean walking away with everything we built, especially not the one thing that still held any meaning for me. After we ended the call, I stayed in that cafe for nearly 2 hours, watching people pass by outside as steam rose from my untouched coffee. I didn't feel anger, at least not the kind that burns. What I felt was a sharpening of purpose, a return to something I hadn't accessed in a long time, that cold clarity that had once made me the most unshakable negotiator in the room. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about drawing a line, holding it, and making sure that, for once, the person who played fair didn't walk away empty-handed. By the time I booked my flight home, my mind was already ahead of the process. There would be paperwork, resistance, maybe even threats. But it didn't matter. I had the trust. I had the documents. And for the first time in years, I also had the upper hand. I didn't tell Melanie I was coming home early, nor did I text or call to let her know that the illusion of control she'd created was about to unravel. After landing in Raleigh just past noon on a Saturday, I rented a car and drove the familiar stretch of coastal highway toward Arlen's Point in silence, each mile peeling away another layer of disbelief. leaving behind only clarity and quiet resolve. I wasn't angry in the way most people expect, not the explosive kind, but rather sharpened, distilled into something firmer and quieter than rage, a commitment to reclaim what was mine. The house sat just as I remembered, its white trim catching the afternoon sun, the tall palms swaying gently in the salty breeze, serene, even welcoming, as if unaware that a storm had been brewing inside its walls. But as I pulled into the gravel driveway and saw the sleek black convertible, one I didn't recognize, parked squarely in the spot where my truck used to sit, that calm fractured into something colder. I stepped out slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle around me. The front door was ajar, and from inside I could hear voices, hers unmistakably light and buoyant, and a man's, lower and more confident than it had any right to be. They were laughing, and through the open window came a fragment of a conversation about knocking down the wall between the kitchen and dining room. Something about open concept flow and resale value, like this was some kind of design project, not the life I'd spent years building. I placed my suitcase quietly by the entryway and walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps firm but measured. Melanie stood at the island in a sundress I'd never seen before, her hair pulled back casually, a glass of champagne resting in her hand, like she'd already begun celebrating a future she hadn't earned. Across from her stood Derek, athletic, tan, and entirely too comfortable, gesturing at something on a tablet as if this was his home to redesign. Their laughter died the moment I entered. Melanie's smile faltered, just slightly, before she recovered and said, "Frank, I didn't expect you back until Monday." "Clearly," I replied, my eyes locking briefly with Derek's, who dropped his arm from her waist with just enough awkwardness to confirm everything I already knew. "This is awkward," he mumbled, attempting a chuckle that never quite reached his eyes. I'd rather you stay," I cut in, keeping my tone level. "This concerns you too, apparently." Melanie's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance, her voice tightening as she said, "Frank, let's not make this harder than it has to be. I've been unhappy for a long time. We both deserve a clean break." I nodded slowly, stepping closer to the counter and setting down my briefcase. "I agree completely," I said, "which is why I've already spoken to my attorney regarding the fraudulent property sale you attempted." Colour drained from her face so quickly it was almost breathtaking. "What are you talking about?" she asked, voice caught somewhere between indignation and panic. I calmly opened the briefcase and pulled out the deed, the one she'd signed months ago without reading, buried in the stack of refinancing documents she'd waved off between sips of iced coffee and hurried glances at her phone. I laid it in front of her like a final chess move. "This house," I said, "was transferred into the Holloway Trust last spring. You signed the documents. You don't own it. You haven't for nearly a year." Derek looked at her, confused. "You said the sale went through," he said, his confidence cracking just enough to reveal the thin veneer it had always been. "It did," she insisted, snatching the papers and flipping through them, her fingers trembling. "This isn't possible." "Not only is it possible," I said, my voice steady, "it's legally binding. The sale you initiated is null and void. The county's been notified, and the buyer has already pulled out. There's nothing left to transfer." Derek stepped back, his entire posture collapsing inward. "I'll wait in the car," he muttered, before hurrying out without another word. Once we were alone, Melanie turned toward me, rage replacing disbelief. "You tricked me," she snapped. You buried this in paperwork and made me sign it. No, I said plainly. I protected my assets, a standard practice in my profession. You chose not to read what you were signing. That's not trickery. That's negligence. She tried to recover, softening her tone. Frank, we can still work something out. We can split the proceeds. There's no reason to involve lawyers. There already are lawyers, I replied. And not just mine. The buyers you misled are considering action of their own, selling a property you don't own. That's fraud, Melanie. Real fraud. Not just moral failure. Her jaw clenched, her voice dropped to a whisper. You wouldn't. I'm not doing anything, I said, folding the documents and sliding them back into my briefcase. I'm simply enforcing what's already in place. What happens next depends entirely on you. She grabbed her phone, tapping furiously. I'm calling my sister's lawyer. You won't get away with this. You should absolutely consult an attorney, I said as I turned to leave. I'll be staying at the Harborview Hotel downtown to give you space. But let's be clear, this house is not for sale, and I'll be moving back in on Monday. I paused at the doorway, looking back at her one last time. She stood alone in the kitchen we'd renovated together, a full glass of champagne in her hand and a future evaporating before her eyes. This isn't over, Frank, she hissed. I met her gaze without flinching. Actually, Melanie, I said, I think it is. The following morning, I sat across from Ben Hollowell in his office, a quiet corner suite on the 6th floor of a building that once housed a textile company, now converted into a law firm that specialized in salvaging what others tried to steal. The halls were silent, the fluorescent lights dimmed, and the air had that early Sunday stillness, the kind that settles only when most people are still in their beds, unaware their lives are changing. Ben looked tired, though not from lack of sleep. More like the kind of fatigue that comes from carrying truths heavier than the people who ask you to uncover them. He didn't offer pleasantries or coffee, just pushed a folder toward me and said, "There's more." Inside were documents I hadn't expected to see. Bank statements, credit card records, lease applications, even travel receipts. At first glance, the numbers blurred together, but the implications grew clearer with each page. Melanie had opened a separate account nearly a year ago, discreetly transferring over $170,000 from our joint savings. That wasn't just carelessness. That was intent. That money represented years of disciplined living, of skipped vacations, of quiet sacrifices we never discussed because they were understood. And now, it was gone. There's also this, Ben said, sliding another document forward. It was a lease agreement, already in process for a retail space in downtown Savannah. A boutique fitness studio registered under two names, Melanie Holloway and Derek Martin. I sat back in the chair, the ceiling lights casting a dull glare on the paperwork. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't passion clouding judgment or an impulsive decision to chase youth. This was structured, strategic, calculated. They'd been planning this long before the phone call, long before the fake listing, long before Melanie looked me in the eye and told me she wanted a clean break. They weren't trying to just take the house. They were trying to build their future on the ashes of mine. The pieces aligned sickeningly well. The forged sale wasn't meant to go through smoothly. It was a shell transaction, set up to underprice the house, complete the deal quickly, and then resell it for a profit, all before I could untangle the paperwork. Ben leaned forward and tapped the last page. The buyer of the Bay House? A shell company owned by a Jason Martin, Derek's brother. They were going to flip it once the smoke cleared, pocket the upside, disappear, and leave you with the mess. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say, only a deep, steady pulse at the base of my skull that came with the realization that betrayal had turned into a coordinated scheme. One that involved lies, signatures, stolen funds, and names I once heard at holiday dinners. Ben's voice softened. Legally, you're protected. The trust holds. The sale can't proceed. But as for the money, that's trickier. Florida's an equitable distribution state. If we push for full recovery, Melanie's attorney will argue it was marital property, her share. I nodded slowly, my jaw tightening. And the fraud? That's our leverage, he replied. Attempted sale of a property she didn't own. Money funneled into a business using funds she misrepresented. Potentially grand theft, depending on how far we want to go. But I assume you're not interested in prison bars, just resolution. He was right. As much as my chest burned with betrayal, I didn't want revenge that ruined lives, just one that rebalanced the scales. What do you propose? I asked, my voice calm but firm. Ben laid out a draft settlement, one that offered a clean exit, but didn't let deception walk away without consequence. Melanie would return 60% of the withdrawn funds, renounce all claims to the house and any future value it might accrue, and in return, I would waive any interest in her business and agree not to pursue criminal charges. Clean. Final. Just. And if she refuses? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Ben's face didn't change. Then we go to court, and we bring every document, every transfer, every lease and signature into that courtroom, and we let the district attorney decide what to do next. By the time I returned to the hotel, my phone was already buzzing. First Melanie, then her sister, and finally a number I didn't recognize, likely her attorney. I let them all go to voicemail. That evening, as I sat alone in my room going through documents, scanning every withdrawal, every timestamp, every name scribbled on a form she'd hoped I'd never see, the numbness I had felt began to fade, replaced not with anger, but with a sobering clarity. This wasn't about hurt anymore. It wasn't about the marriage we had or the betrayal that ended it. It was about the principle, the truth that no one, not even someone you once trusted with your life, had the right to take from you without consequence. This had never just been an affair. It had been a plan. A quiet, meticulous theft cloaked in romance and manipulation. And now, I wasn't just reclaiming my home. I was reclaiming my sense of justice. 3 weeks later, I sat across from Melanie in the conference room at Ben's office, the same table where we'd once signed investment contracts and updated our wills, now the sight of something colder and more final. Her attorney, a man at least 10 years younger than me, with a suit a little too crisp and a voice a little too eager, shuffled papers as if the right arrangement might change the outcome. Melanie didn't look at me, not once. She kept her eyes on the surface of the table, her shoulders pulled back too tightly, her hands clasped together in a way that tried to mimic confidence, but couldn't quite hide the tremor in her fingers. Since that day in the kitchen, she'd stopped communicating directly. Everything came through her lawyer, every threat, every denial, every last-ditch attempt to discredit what was already undeniable. Ben, calm and methodical as ever, slid 3 documents across the table without ceremony. The trust deed confirming my sole ownership of the house, the bank records detailing every unauthorized withdrawal, and an affidavit signed by Jason Martin, Derek's brother, admitting to the fraudulent property scheme. The affidavit, plain and damning, removed the last foothold her legal team thought they had. Melanie's lawyer skimmed it, then leaned toward her, whispering something that made her jaw tighten and her eyes harden. She still didn't look at me when he spoke aloud. "We're prepared to settle," Ben gave a single nod and repeated the offer we had agreed upon. Melanie would return $100,000 of the misappropriated funds, relinquish all rights to the house and any properties protected under the trust, and in return, I would waive all interest in her business venture and agree not to pursue criminal charges against her or her partners. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, for the first time that morning, Melanie's voice broke the silence. Quiet, brittle, but audible. "And if I refuse?" Ben's voice didn't waver. "Then we present this evidence to the district attorney. Fraud exceeding $100,000 is a serious offense under state law. Restitution will no longer be the conversation." Her attorney placed a hand gently on her arm, and the two of them left the room to confer privately. I stared out the window during those 17 minutes, watching the slow movement of clouds against the mid-morning sky, thinking not of Melanie or Derek or what I'd lost, but of the stillness I hadn't known I needed. When they returned, Melanie signed without a word. Her signature, once so familiar from birthday cards and family checks, looked foreign now, like something forged by someone else. I signed after her. Just like that, it was over. 6 months passed. I didn't hear from her again, not directly. Through mutual friends, I learned she and Derek had opened their fitness studio in Savannah after all, though on a much smaller scale than planned. Business wasn't going well. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that, only a muted sadness, not for her, not even for us, but for what might have been if honesty had played any part in her choices. Back at the Bay House, I poured myself into renovations. Not just the kind you can see, new siding, hurricane windows, updated plumbing, but the kind that reclaims a place, piece by piece, from someone else's shadow. I replaced things, not because they were broken, but because I didn't want them to remind me of what had been. Slowly, the house became mine again, not just on paper, but in spirit. On a quiet Sunday morning, I stood on the back deck with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the tide roll in, steady and sure. The sky was painted in soft golds and greys, and the waves moved with the same rhythm they always had, indifferent to the storms humans bring upon themselves. There was no victory in that moment, only peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of clarity. I had stood my ground, not to punish, but to protect. I had defended what mattered, not for revenge, but to reclaim something deeper, my self-respect. This journey wasn't about destroying someone else. It was about not allowing myself to be quietly erased. And in the end, that was enough. If this story spoke to something in you, a quiet truth, a betrayal buried deep, or the strength to stand when it would have been easier to fall, then I invite you to stay with us. This channel is a place for those who've been broken, but not defeated. For those who've lost, but chose to rebuild. For those who believe that justice, though slow, still matters. Subscribe for more stories of truth, redemption, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. You're not alone, and your story is not over.